Germany's joining a growing number of EU countries considering mandatory vaccinations. Ursula von der Leyen says she supports it, the EU Commission chief. A move like this, even during a health pandemic, it does bring up the question of personal freedom, does it not?
It does, but we've had this conversation, I suppose, for the past 2 years. Even things like lockdowns, restrictions, give up the question about personal freedoms. But of course, as Ursula von der Leyen and others are saying, this is a crisis. But I'm joined now by Liam Herrick, who's the Executive Director of the Irish Council for Civil Liberties, on this. Liam, talk us through the balance that needs to be weighed up in relation to the greater good of society. We've seen, obviously, a disproportionate number of people taking up ICU beds who are unvaccinated versus an individual's freedom to decide not to be vaccinated.
Well, I think in terms of the public health effort more generally, in terms of any restrictions that states are trying to implement, they need to be justified as proportionate. So they need to demonstrate that the public health benefit outweighs the imposition on people's rights. When we come to medical treatment, there are very strong rights under the European Convention on Human Rights in terms of private life, private and family life, and bodily integrity. So the state would have a very high bar to meet to either mandate directly or indirectly a particular medical treatment. And across Europe, you've had historically very different approaches to this question. In countries like Ireland, for example, there's a strong tradition of voluntary vaccination. And in other Central European countries, there has been a tradition of quite commonplace to make vaccination mandatory. And that would, of course, be culturally relevant as well. What's interesting, of course, is that many of the countries that have had the most high rates of take-up of vaccination have been countries with a voluntary program. So mandatory vaccination programs don't necessarily achieve a higher result.
But I suppose they do if, like in Austria, you're going to be charged €7,000 for not being vaccinated, there could be a criminal offence. And, you know, from the state's point of view, this isn't about imposing something on someone. It's about saying the rest of society is suffering because people won't get vaccinated. We've seen in hospitals in Ireland people not being able to get a lung transplant because the ICUs were filled. And so where does, I suppose, the social contract and the greater good of society impinge on the individual's rights?
Well, I think the starting point is to appreciate how severe a measure it is to mandate a particular form of treatment because how important we value privacy, and particularly with regard to medical treatment. So the World Health Organization has been very clear that mandatory vaccination laws or policies must be a measure of last resort. So it's incumbent on the state to exhaust all other measures, first of all. That includes other measures to encourage vaccination on a voluntary basis, which have been very successful in many countries, and also needs to be in the round of all of the other public health tools available to a state. So in many countries, there's been an underinvestment in other measures such as ventilation, contact tracing, testing, and so on. And I think the state would have to demonstrate that it exhausted all of these measures to their maximum potential before it could justify resorting towards a mandatory vaccination policy.
I think we'll have some member states trying to say that they did and others finding that that hasn't been the case. But Liam Herrick, thanks very much for joining us.